Well, if it's possible right now, if you can put in the chat where you joining to the conversation, will be fantastic. We are going to start in just 1 minute. Thank you. Also, if you belong to one organization that is working on education, please share it on the chat. It will be fantastic just to know more about each one of you. Thank you. We have Gustavo from Sinaloa, Mexico. We have Mariana from Monterrey, but now she's joining from Boston. Adam in California Bay Area. Clara, de Chile. Thank you, Clara, for being here.
I am from Colombia, but now living in Mexico.
Fantastic, Herman. Nice to see you. Thank you for being here. Well, we're going to start. My name is Eric Ramirez. I'm a co-director of Harvard Alumni for Education, what is called HAED. We created this group that is a global group. We are managing just the chapter for Latin America. I co-direct the chapter of Latin America with Patty Vasquez, who's the executive president of Mexicanos Primero, and also with Gustavo, who is a consultant on leadership that also is here with us. And if you haven't joined Harvard Alumni for Education, you can join. There is the link over there. We're going to put it also in the chat. But basically, we shared a lot of different resources, blogs, opinions, and also these kind of webinars once a month. Besides, we have almost 4,000 people around the world that belongs to Harvard Alumni for Education to this group. In that way, welcome everybody that is here. And as I mentioned to you, Gustavo and Patty are co-directors for Latin America, but also we have coordinators, which is Peter, Ivana, Maria, and Ingrid. They are in different parts all over Latin America doing amazing things. And we are going to start with our speaker today, Linda Nathan. I think that almost everybody knows who she is. She speaks perfectly Spanish, which I didn't know until one day we were walking and she started to speak Spanish, and much better Spanish than I. And she's a lecturer at Harvard and Cambridge College. She's a senior fellow at High Tech High. She founded and confounded 3 public schools in Boston and 3 nonprofit organizations. She's a co-founder of the Perrone Caesar Institute for Creative Leadership. She's a mentor and international consultant on leadership, racial equity, and the arts in education. She's an author of different books. One of them is The Hardest Questions Aren't on the Test. The second is When Grit Isn't Enough. And the third one that we're going to speak about is about building democratic schools. She began as a bilingual teacher in San Juan, Puerto Rico. She has a master from Harvard, a master from Emerson, Antioch, and a BA from UC Berkeley. That's the link also that you can see her blog post. That you can also follow all the different research that she's doing currently. That way, welcome Linda, welcome Gustavo. Gustavo is gonna help us to direct the questions and direct the conversation. If you have any questions, please put it on the chat, and at the end of around 30 minutes, we're gonna start bringing people to ask the questions or just reading the questions. In that way, welcome everybody, and thank you for being here. If you haven't put in the chat also where you joining, and if you have one organization or you're working in certain projects in education, please put it on the chat. In that way, we know who's here. Thank you, and bienvenido, Gustavo, bienvenida, Linda, bienvenidos todos.
Gracias, Eric. Thank you very much. It is a pleasure, as usual, to have Linda inspiring us with her long-standing experience in the field of education, and particularly in the field of democratic education. So, Linda, if it is okay with you, I think the most convenient starting place for all of us is sharing what democratic education is, how we can understand and approach such a context. And welcome to this call.
Ok, muchas gracias. Gracias, Gustavo, Eric, y si Pati llega, muchas gracias a todos. It's really an honor to be here because I have generations of students on this call. I see you all. I see you all, and that's what makes me so happy. Gustavo was one of my students, and this book that we're talking about this evening is one that he co-edited along with Jonathan Mendoza. And for those of you who are teachers, you know what an honor it is to have students say to you, well, let's write a book. And in a moment of insanity, I said, okay. So we did. And through that process, we began to develop a framework that I had been, developing, I guess, on my own for a long time, but it was working with others who were sort of intellectually trying to figure out this thing called democratic education that really helped me hone in on what I'm going to talk about this evening. The first thing I want to dispel is democratic education is not the same as talking about a political system. That's not what I'm talking about this evening. Democracy is from the Greek people, demos, and power, kratos, and that has its own kind of sentido, sense, but that's not the same as political parties. So nothing I'm talking about tonight, of course, there's political undertones, but it is not, I don't want to confuse democratic education with democracy as in a party or a political system. So what is democratic education? That's the question that Gustavo has asked me. And I think one of the ways to think about it is to think about the opposite. An authoritarian school is not a democratic school. An authoritarian school is very easy to maintain if you think about it. An authoritarian school, you do it one way or the highway. But the schools that I've led, the schools that I've founded, deeply believed in student voice, student agency, deeply, deeply, deeply believed in the notion of belonging, of school culture being something dynamic that could change. One of the things that I think about all the time in what is democratic education is, do students and teachers feel that they and their ideas have a place and that they will be heard, listened to, and that things actually might change? So it's not just rhetoric. This idea of schools that practice democratic education has to do with the idea of school not being preparation for life, but school being life. Because what you're doing is coming to school to solve the most urgent problems of your community. And that idea of the common good, that we're in this together and we have issues that we want to disrupt, that to me is democratic education. And what makes it hard is, how do you get all of those stakeholders together and on the same page? Parents, community members, kids, teachers, of course. That's the art of it all. So I hope that helps you understand how I think about democratic education. And I don't know, Gustavo, if you want to show the 4 pillars or not. I don't know if you've been showing, I can't see. But we did develop 4 pillars of democratic education that we think in the book that we edited go a long way in helping people understand what we mean by democratic education. How's that?
Yes. So that was actually our second question, Linda. And right now in the screen, everybody can see what the
Okay.
4 pillars of this democratic education framework are. So why don't you go ahead and explain it to us?
Okay. These 4 pillars are the framework for, the marco teórico, for understanding what is democratic education. This idea, the first pillar is the idea of the open flow of ideas and choices, regardless of their popularity. And we can talk about, I'd love to hear your examples for that. The second pillar is a high quality, equitable education that's accessible and inclusive of all people. And that we really do mean all people. So the most vulnerable in the school need to be those that are thought of first. This idea of the common good. What is the common good? What are we trying to do here? And how do we use active engagement, consensus, and compromise to get there? Doesn't mean everyone has to agree. That's what consensus is. But compromise is really something that's critical for young people and adults to understand. And then this 4th pillar is about the ways in which schools position themselves to address society's most urgent challenges. Here we've said solve, which I don't think is fair to put on young people. They're not necessarily solving them, but they are certainly addressing them. And the idea is, how do we bring teachers and students together with parents? And parents often have very different perspectives than their own students, their own children. So this is a much more complex idea than on the surface. Those are the 4 pillars.
And we also had some guiding questions, right? So why don't you go ahead and explain, because the pillars were actually something that emerged as we went on with the project of editing this book and creating it with a wonderful community of over 70 people. But
Right.
first, when we began, we had only 4 questions to explore. So why don't you share those with the audience?
So we were interested, this was the first time that I endeavored, my work has been in Boston, but I have had the privilege of working over many years in Argentina, Colombia, Puerto Rico is where I began my career. So I know something about global context. And this book really expanded the idea from the US. We wanted to not just be US based. So the first question was, what does democratic schooling mean in various global contexts? How do you talk about democratic schooling when you're in the middle of a coup in Myanmar? And there is a chapter in the book written by one of my students who was in the middle of a coup in Myanmar while she was working on her learning environment. The book is called Designing Democratic Schools and Learning Environments, because we couldn't use the word school for lots of our authors who were in the midst of really difficult political situations. And then this other question of, how do schools actualize liberty, equity, community, and collaborations in their own context? And what do those words mean locally? And then what I've been talking about just now, how do schools manage and evolve to meet the moment, reflect on voice, values, and the goals of their communities, and draw on community resources and funds of knowledge? And then finally, how does democratic schooling prepare students for an unpredictable future? So that's, I think, the one, at least in the United States, we're really in an unpredictable future here. And so we have to really think about, how do we keep creating schools where young people can graduate feeling prepared to enter a very unpredictable future?
Linda, this book was written pretty much entirely by practitioners, right? By
Yes.
people leading at the school level or teaching at the classroom level. So I wanted to ask you, from your perspective, about the role of teachers in democratic schools. What are the opportunities that they have at hand, but also what are the professional conditions that sort of shape how they can act as catalyzers for democratic education?
Yeah. So first, if you could show the slide of the sage on the stage and the pouring in of knowledge. So I just want people to see, this is the 19th century image of the sage on the stage, and that's a student and the teacher pouring knowledge in. So that is not the role of a teacher in a democratic school. And then the next slide really shows how we think about teachers as catalyzers. And I appreciate that word catalyzer for democratic education. So teachers need to feel that they have valid, authentic participation in decision making, that they have professional autonomy and ownership. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't a mandated curriculum. That's not what that's about. But that means I, as a teacher, feel that my voice matters, that my expertise matters, and that people are going to listen to me, and that my professional growth and well-being is important in the life of this school. Teachers as catalyzers for democratic education also speaks to this idea of stability and continuity. When I go into schools that are turning over every 3 years, the teachers are leaving every 3 years, that is a recipe for disaster. It takes 8 years, 8 years to be a good teacher, not 3. 8 años, 3 years to learn your craft, 3 years to get better, and then the next 3 you can say, I know something about teaching. So if you have schools that are hiring very young, untrained teachers, it's going to be very, very hard to create a system that I think honors democratic education. And then finally, this is perhaps the most important, this idea of a collaborative culture. Do we all come together and share the same values? Do we talk about those values together? Do we sit in a circle and debate with one another? Are there students in that circle with us? Or are students over here and the adults are over there? Never the twain shall meet. I'm going to, and I've helped to found yet another school that is going to open in September. It's in Lynn, Mass, in the North Shore. It's called CASA, City Arts and Science Academy. It's a STEAM school. Sergeant, you better apply for a job. And I am so impressed because that principal is running our first pop-up teacher institute, but not just with teachers. He's invited all of the sixth graders and their parents. So we're going to work together on what does STEAM mean? How do we even understand that word, but not just teachers? And that, I think, is what a collaborative culture really looks like.
Linda, you're now mentioning Lynn. Lynn is a community that is, I don't know if well known, but if you can say something about it, that is definitely has not had the opportunities as other places in Massachusetts. And you've also mentioned the countries you've worked with internationally. And in many of these places, many of these democratic schools serve students from historically marginalized communities.
Mhm.
So what does it mean to design democratic learning spaces in contexts that are shaped by inequality?
Mhm. So I'll first say what is Lynn. It's in the north of Boston. It's been a very working class community. It's now probably 90% immigrant um, from Central and Latin America, Vietnam, Cambodia. It's one of the poorest communities right outside Boston, has had none of the resources that a city like Boston has had. So it's very exciting that this new school is opening, has a really visionary principal, Yvonne Alvarez, who, no irony here, no coincidence, she was also the principal of New World School for the Arts in Miami. So it's always the artists that find the way to do very bold things. So the idea, so many people feel that kids that are born into poverty, black or brown kids, kids that are from rural backgrounds, kids that have not had the advantages of more middle class or upper middle class kids, and this is anywhere in the world, that those kids need a very regimented diet of I teach, you learn, I do, and then you do. And that's to me a recipe for disaster. Just because you're poor, just because you may be, from what we say in the United States, is a minority race, although we are fast becoming a majority minority country, that doesn't have anything to do with the kind of education you should get. So, what I always think about when people say, but don't kids who come from poverty need a stricter kind of discipline or a more regimented kind of education, I think, huh, isn't that interesting that you think that way? Where'd you get that idea from? We want to give our most disadvantaged the richest kind of education, the most interdisciplinary, the most project based that we possibly can. That doesn't mean that you don't teach the building blocks. Those two things do not go hand in hand. But I get really annoyed when people ask me, like, shouldn't they have? And the author that I turn to is Jonathan Kozol, who's written so much about American schools, apartheid in American schools. And he's really taken on this issue that we treat poor kids, we treat black and brown kids so much like second class citizens. And in fact, we give them a second class education. You can be guaranteed, and I'm sure this is the same in Latin America, that if you grow up with a zip code, a código, that signifies a more working class or poor background, you will not have an arts education. You can be guaranteed. Now, why do we do that? The children that grow up with less advantage need more arts. They don't necessarily just need double English, double math, which is the way we run our schools now.
Linda, you're referring to strategic decisions that are often made by school leaders. Of course, there is always like the policy dimension, but what is the role and how can school leaders influence in fostering a more democratic environment, not only in classrooms, but across all the big areas or dimensions of school life, right?
Mhm.
Family relationships and key decision making. I know that the scheduling for you is very important. So why don't you walk us through
Yeah.
school and education leadership?
So for me, the role of the leader is to always keep the vision and the mission front and center, to always ensure that teachers, students, family members, community members feel that we are living, as we said at Boston Arts Academy, our shared values. So having a set of shared values is critical because shared values create a shared school culture. And it's the guiding beliefs and values that really tell us how a school is going to operate. That's how we develop our norms, our routines, our behavior. If we don't have a set of values, and if the leader doesn't continually articulate those values. So every morning at the Arts Academy, Carmen Torres, my co-head, would get on the intercom and say, remember the shared values, passion with balance, or vision with integrity. And I'm sure if Charleston came off his mic, he would do the other two shared values. And he graduated many, many decades ago, but they were ingrained in our students and in our teachers. And today, I can hear him shouting them. I know you are. I know you know them. Diversity with respect. Let's keep going. So that's what's so critical in fostering a democratic culture. Everyone needs to have some involvement in school government, in the governance of the school, how we make decisions here. That includes parents. And many leaders or teachers sometimes say, we can't get the parents involved. They're too busy. And I always ask, what time do you have the meetings? When do you have them? Because if you have the meetings during the school day, of course you can't get parents involved. You have to have the meetings on weekends or in the evening. I've heard principals say, no, we can't get parents to help their kids with financial aid. And I'm like, really? How do you do that? Do you do it in the evenings? Do you do it 6 different times? Do you do it in many languages? It takes 8 ways, just like I said, 8 years for a teacher. It takes 8 ways to get a parent or a caregiver to really begin to embrace and to understand that this school is not a threat, but this school is part of my culture too. And particularly when you have families from many diverse backgrounds or languages or countries of origin, you have to work even harder at that. I hope that helps. I have a really cool slide about what school culture looks like, structures, systems, beliefs, and
Yeah,
actions.
that's the
And
one.
yeah, I wonder if you want to show that for a second.
Yeah, that's the one everybody's seeing right now.
Okay, good. Because it's the interaction of structures and systems, beliefs, and actions, right? It's how you move through that. That's what matters. And that's the role of the leader, to keep saying, here are the structures and systems. Okay, they're not perfect. We can keep changing. And one of the things that Gustavo wanted me to reference was the role of the schedule. That to me is metaphor for everything. The schedule are those blocks of time, at least in most, this is a secondary thing, a little less in primaria, but high school for sure. English, math, history, all your courses. It's where teachers teach. The schedule is a metaphor for how you use people, time, and your resources. I led Boston Arts Academy for 14 years. We had 15 different schedules. And people are like, what? You must have been crazy, all you people. And I'm like, no, we kept learning. We kept learning from the students. We kept learning from each other. And we kept saying, what are our goals this year? And you have to articulate your goals every year. That's part of a powerful school culture. That's part of what a leader does. And if the schedule doesn't match your goals, then it better change. And so this idea of a schedule being written by some computer programmer or some registrar in some room that doesn't have the input of faculty and even students is a real mistake. Now, we did emerge finally and say we couldn't change the schedule every year. We had to wait and have discussions for 2 years from now, which was actually a kind of cool way to do things, to say we're having a discussion now that won't get implemented for 2 years. That lowered the temperature. So the schedule for me is so much about how we think about our most important resources.
Linda, I know the next question is a special one for you. You've led schools that are art schools, and you've, as you said, you've helped found many of them. And in the book, actually, many of them are actually inspired by the power of art. And I wanted to ask you, from your perspective, what's the contribution that the arts can make in building democratic learning environments?
Yeah. So for me, first of all, I just want to say I'm so proud. I know there's artists on this call, and that makes me really proud because I don't want to be in a room without artists. Artists see beyond barriers. They can look around, above, through, the wall doesn't matter. Artists are not afraid to take risks. Art is never finished. It's always evolving, always evolving. And artists need an audience. So arts is relational. Even a visual artist who says, I paint alone, or I'm a potter, I do ceramic, wheel thrown, and I don't want anyone in the studio with me, but I need people to buy my work and I need people to use my work. So it's a constant exchange, right? And I think more than any other discipline, art fosters openness, dialogue, and this idea of co-creation is so critical. And that doesn't mean that the sciences aren't important. I'm so excited to be working on this new STEAM school where we'll figure out this synergy between science and math and arts. But arts play a special role in allowing us to co-author our own narrative. And that's what's so critical for young people. Young people need to be able to tell their own story, and the arts provide a pathway to do that.
Linda, finally, and before we jump into questions from the audience, so if anybody wants to jump in, we'll ask Linda a one question on this panel, and then she'll be able to reply directly to your queries and questions and comments. But right now, I mean, you are in Cambridge right now. This call is organized by a group of former Huxley students, and right now it's not easy times for Harvard, and it's not easy times for democracy in general. This is a major driver, a big idea in that inspired the work we did in the book. And I think that we need to balance the sense of reality and the sense of the hardships of the now with the sense of hope of what's possible. So finally, I wanted to ask you what gives you hope today as you continue and we continue this work of reimagining schools, reimagining education for democracy.
So I don't know what you're showing, but I hope you show the picture of all my students at Harvard all over various years. What gives me hope is pretty
Yes.
simple. It's my students. These are graduate students, but I've just come today. I was telling Gustavo, I had the privilege today of going to a middle school in Chelsea, Mass, really close to here, where one of my former Boston Arts Academy students received a national award for the Barbara Henry Award for Teachers of Courage. Barbara Henry in 1960 was the only white teacher that taught Ruby Bridges, the Ruby Bridges that is so iconic in American civil rights lore. And Barbara Henry is now in her 80s, and she traveled to give Laura Lodoño this award. And boy, did that give me hope today, because there I was with a former high school student of mine getting a national award from a very well-known person. And I thought, I said to the class of eighth graders, what gives me hope is all of you. These little eighth graders so proud of their teacher, and I'm so proud of my former high school students. So, what gives me hope, these are very difficult times. And yes, as Gustavo said, Harvard is really, really, really being beaten up by this bully, number 47. But I don't believe that Harvard will fold, because I think Harvard understands that our entire country's, democracy, big D, really is dependent on this. And so I keep teaching. I'm not a spring chicken anymore, but I keep teaching because I think it's so important to try to continue to inspire hope, to share the stories of where I've been successful, where I've uh, been challenged, where I've not been successful, because we want to make sure that there's many generations that want to create schools that matter for young people.
Lita, before we close it up, right now people are seeing a slide inviting them to download the book, to join the democratic
Oh, great.
education community on LinkedIn. But would you want to say anything about your upcoming work, your upcoming books, so that people
Sure.
get acquainted with what's new with Linda Nathan
Yeah,
as an author?
sure, sure. So I'm working on two other books right now. Um, One is inspired by this book, crazy as that one was, and I'm doing a book called "Does Democracy Matter?" 25 years later, and I'm studying six schools. These are chapters that will be written by students, teachers, and founders of these schools. And yes, one of them is being written by students at Boston Arts Academy and co-authored with two of my graduate students. But they're schools all around the United States that have been fighting this fight for democratic practices in their context. And so we'll put together that second book, really inspired by this first one. And then thanks to Gustavo and Patti, I'm working with about 35 Mexican educators who I'm going to travel at the end of this month to work with them. And they're going to write a book in Spanish. Estoy tan orgullosa que por fin en español, we're going to have a book about democratic education en español because we couldn't get this one translated. And so those teachers I'll be working with to tell their stories of their schools and their prácticas and how they see democratic education in their context. And then finally, the last book that I'm working on is more memoir like. Some of you know that I spent 44 years with my gran colega y amiga Carmen Torres, and she died 3 years ago. And we began our career together in 1979. We worked together almost every day for 44 years, and her death absolutely destroyed me. And so I decided she'd read a lot of the pieces that I had been working on about our early career together. So I'm really now working on a more memoir-like book for educational leaders with Carmen como la espina as the spine of the book. So that'll be a more personal narrative about how I view a teaching life and what gives me hope. So I hope that's three different books. I don't know if I'm going to live long enough to finish them all, but we'll do our best.
You will. Eric, pass it on to you so you can lead us with the questions from the audience. I think Germán has
Yep. Please pass it directly to the people that has the hand up.
Germán, go ahead.
Thank you very much for this inspiring session, dealing with democracy in all the dimensions. Let me just deviate a little bit the attention, but to add up to the whole scenario, dealing with the artificial intelligence issue. We have been concerned with the whole thing, and let me just point little issues about. It all started when I was advisor of science for the president of Colombia in 1982, when Nicolas Negroponte and Seymour Papert arrived to visit the president and all these things, and we launched a strategy to educate teachers to use artificial intelligence, 1982, that now, because we had this idea that it would be very important 30 years after. And, it turned to be like a prophecy. And one of the issues that emerged was the idea of global citizens. And that offered me the opportunity to work with Fernando Reimers. You all know him, particularly in the curriculum for global citizens and this kind of issues. And now the concern is the following. Artificial intelligence is moving from text we are interacting today with text, with artificial intelligence, into images.
Mhm.
That will change the processors. You know, thousands of processors that are dealing with artificial intelligence will move to the need for quantum processors. So the connection between artificial intelligence and quantum processors is around the corner.
Mm.
So you can imagine, you are presenting the whole situation. You can imagine, what do we do to help teachers all over the region to work with this issue?
Mhm.
So we have been working with Ricardo Hausman with the complexity index and all these kind of things, because he's pushing politically the issue that the prediction for economic performance of the countries has a direct relationship with the index of uh, uh, cognitive ability in the countries.
Mhm.
So merging these points creates a platform, let's say, to help teachers change the orbit.
Mm.
So we are all together here, facing a lot of limitations and all these things, but we have to see the future coming
Mhm.
very soon, and we have
Mhm.
to urgently help teachers all over the region
Mhm.
to address these issues.
Mhm.
So, excuse me for the extension, but
Mhm.
you know, you can feel myself
Mhm.
the anguish and the
Mhm.
sense of urgency that
Mhm.
we see in these kind of things.
Mhm.
And it's not a subject of technology; it's participation, is equity, is the capability to be inclusive,
Mhm.
as you are saying, with the arts, with all these new technologies are leaving behind civilizations at all.
Mhm.
So we have to do something. Thank you
Mhm.
very much, and please excuse me.
Mhm. Thank you for your comments.
Linda, perhaps you would like to address particularly the piece on how do we work with teachers around adapting to the disruptions or changes by artificial intelligence. Right now, text is challenging enough. Next, when we can identify who's actually saying something in reality or in artificial intelligence in the future, I think that's definitely something that's going to affect how educators are tackling not only like cognitive processes but also like the moral and the ethical standards. So
Mhm.
it's I imagine you have something to say about that.
Well, I'm old enough to remember classrooms without computers, right? And so when computers came, teachers freaked out. Like, what are we doing with these things? This is terrible. What happened to this? We can't. I don't think we can stop change. I've been really energized by my own graduate students, some who are on this call, helping me understand how to effectively use AI. So it's been really a fun journey for me. I'm not afraid of it. And I think I would want teachers to enter space. It's one of the fundamental questions that we're going to be asking in CASA, this new school. What's the role of AI? What's the role of AI in the arts? What's the role of AI with dance? What's the role of AI with music? I think, that synergy is really, really important. Kids who are second language learners can really be advantaged by AI because there's a way in which that can be very, very helpful. However, school systems, and this is happening in many of the districts I coach in, this I don't think is helpful, are using AI as counselors. That I think is cuckoo nuts. So a kid can actually log in and see a counselor who is not a counselor, but is a bot, and talk about their problems. That I think is cuckoo nuts. So I
Mhm.
think there are places that we can do really well with AI, like as a friendly editor, as someone to say, I was just working with a former student of mine who's a really renowned musician and dancer. and he composed a beautiful song for a colleague of ours that died. And I called him and I said, that was amazing music. I have never heard you do that kind of music. And he said, my friend AI was really helpful. And so it was him, but he had editing help from AI. And that I think is okay. So I think, what Gustavo said, the ethical, moral, this isn't that different than what we experienced 40 years ago when we first started with computers. We had all sorts of moral and ethical issues. We were so worried about kids plagiarizing. Same thing now. Some of the best teachers I know do not have their students do homework at home. They have their kids do homework in school. Handwrite, no AI, because I want to know your baseline. I want to know your voice.
We have a question from Adam. Adam, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Professor, for the presentation. I have a question. It's kind of two parts. So I'm in the Bay Area, but I'm originally from Chicago, and we do a lot of what's called action civics, which is many of the things that you're talking about. My question kind of comes with that many of the schools that I've worked with, their budgets are much smaller than other school districts, and you have lower retention. You have teachers that are being recruited that may not be paid competitively to other districts, so they're just in the ability for them to get the teaching workforce that they need is harder. You kind of spoke to young teachers versus kind of teachers that are more experienced teachers, but I think that the first part of the question is, maybe thinking about schools as being incubators for teachers from their own community, getting youth who are from the community to be educators in the schools that have they'll be more likely to retain them and get them because they are local and they're there and they also have a connection to the community, and that might lead to more student success, more community culture. And then those educators will become site leaders and educator leaders and whatnot. So, maybe speak to that as the first part of the question of how do you incubate a school as a source of community development, but as the same way of building educators who want to be at that school site, want to stay there, want to see the success. And then also increase student voice and agency and engagement with that. The second part of the question is this idea of educators who go to school sites that are not necessarily delegates, but trustees, and they believe themselves to be trustees in the sense that they don't necessarily do what the community wants them to do. They think that they are enabled by whatever organization or relationship that they have with the community to make decisions for that community, and they're not doing it as a delegate, they're doing it as trustees, and kind of the relationship of this is what we know, what we believe is good for the community. We didn't even ask them. We just believe that they want more discipline. They want more test-based structures. They want more college and career readiness rather than community organizing, a democratic classroom student voice, that they want less of that because, what the end result is for economic or whatnot. And whether it's charter schools or whatnot, kind of making that trustee decision. So the first thing is about teacher retention and building community within the teaching workforce. And the second question is about the dynamic of schools with trustee approaches versus delegate approaches.
Great questions. So in Massachusetts, we're very fortunate. We have a number of pipeline programs, paraprofessional. Those are, for those who don't know the term, that would be a not certified teacher, but an aide, if you will, may not have as much college, may not even have a full college degree, but they're in programs that the district runs or universities are running, where it's called para to teacher pipeline programs. And those are, I think, the most successful. So a number of the districts around here have those programs. And, it doesn't mean just because I don't want to make this, so black and white, so stark. Just because you come from a community doesn't mean you're going to be a great teacher. It might mean, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you understand the community just because you grew up there, but you have a better sense of having some cultural capital. So in one school that I've been working in recently, the paraprofessionals play a very important role in that school, and many of them are now involved in a local college to get their bachelor's degree and their teacher licensure with an understanding that they'll continue on in that school district. And I think that's a very important kind of program, as long as those paraprofessionals receive the support to get in, this is in the US context, to get licensed, because for many young people who come from marginalized communities, that licensure exam is a sticking point, and that's why they don't become teachers. So I think the para pipeline programs are very important. And then the question that you were asking about teachers as trustees as opposed to delegates, I would sort of flip that and say, I asked two fundamental questions in all of the schools that I ran. What do we think students should know? What do we, upon graduation? And what do we think students should be able to do upon graduation? And by asking that very broad question, lots of different groups, to students, to parents, to community members, we found really interesting ways of thinking about what is knowledge and what is skills. So very concretely, when we opened Boston Arts Academy, this is in 1998, I held a series of community meetings all across the city with educators, with artists, with community people, students, parents, and I asked those two questions again and again and again. And I had some help with an organization that scribed for me, actually took notes for me. And what came out was so surprising. It would never have been what I would have thought for graduates of the Boston Arts Academy. But what we heard from every sector was graduates of the Boston Arts Academy have to be able to write a grant. And not just any grant, but a grant for money for their artistic and academic enterprises that they wanted to do. And that shaped the trajectory of the Boston Arts Academy. I know Charleston's smiling because he remembers what his senior grant project was all about. All of our graduates had to do that. That would never have emerged if we hadn't asked those two fundamental questions about knowledge and skills.
Linda, we also have a question from the chat. So it's from Martina. She's a medical student under Professor Camila from Brazil. And it's about your beliefs, particularly in higher education, right? So how can these ideas from democratic education at the school level transfer to higher education, particularly in medical schools or medical training?
Mm-hmm. She's just trying to get me to say yes to a research project. Very well done, Martina. I know where you're coming from. So obviously, I think higher education plays an enormously important role. For the most part, higher education has not celebrated what I would consider democratic education. I think higher education is still pretty stuck in a lecture mode. I know, and I will tell you, and you will listen. It is not particularly inclusive. The idea of sharing knowledge, of experiential knowledge, which is what I really promote, hasn't yet made its way into higher education. And I don't know that much about medical school training, except that my son is a pediatrician, and I know that his training was pretty traditional. But this idea that, particularly in medical schools, that the notion of listening first, of noticing, listening, how do you make that learning visible? As opposed to coming in like the sage on the stage, that slide that we saw earlier. So I think it's a both and. But what I would say is where we see some of the most democratic education is in early childhood, particularly in rooms with centers. So try to visualize what I want you to see. Those of you who know Reggio kinds of schools or Montessori kind of schools, you might have a picture, but don't worry about what type it is. Imagine a preschool. You go in the morning with your 3-year-old, your 2-year-old. Over there is the sand table. Over here is the truck table. Over here are the musical instruments. Behind you are the dress up. And somewhere is this new thing about lights that we're going to work on today. And kids come in and they choose. They choose where they want to go. And that's the way the day begins, with this real sense of voice, agency, interest. And I think if we can think of classrooms like really good preschool rooms, even in higher ed, we're going to be a lot further along. And this one may sound crazy, but high schools, college gets this, higher ed gets this, but high school doesn't. Everyone needs rest hour. Everyone needs a nap. And preschools get that. And I know that sounds silly, but I don't think so. This idea of recess and a nap, what does that mean in our democratic schools?
Linda, I think we have just final minutes for a quick couple questions. We have a very interesting question on the chat from Maria about how to teach for literacy, futures literacy in particular, because we mentioned this idea on the book, teaching to navigate an unpredictable future. And we have a question from Alejandro also, who's live here. So Alejandro, why don't you go ahead and pose your question?
I will try to be brief, Gustavo, and thank you, Professor Linda. I'm just thinking on how refreshing and inspiring it is to go back to look at the local practices happening in the schools, in the ground, from the grassroots, but with the pressure of learning outcomes, reading comprehension, and math. How can a teacher in a low and middle income country like Mexico find the balance with this pressure of achieving learning outcomes like math, like reading, and this new framework which he or she wasn't prepared for, and there's no resources for achieving this. So how to balance that from this perspective, from those learning outcomes and the pressure on achieving reading comprehension and math, and the urgency to look into the relationship with the self and the other through the arts, through democracy.
It's a completely valid question. The thing is, urgency doesn't mean kill and drill. We have to sort of break apart those terms. There is tremendous urgency to raise reading levels, to raise math levels. But I'm a former theater teacher, and I taught students who didn't come with much English, and theater was a terrific way to get them to speak English, and for my the Spanish speakers, and for my Spanish speakers to speak English, and for my English speakers, you couldn't get a lead in the play unless you were bilingual. So my English speakers also had to learn Spanish. So bilingualism became cool. And that urgency of learning to produce in two languages was very, very powerful. So I'm a deep believer in dual language education and bilingual education. And I think this math as well, there's so many, and I don't want to make it that arts is the handmaiden to math. However, many of my students who really disliked math, when they got into set design or music, and you could make the parallels to mathematical thinking, really appreciated, oh, geez, if I'm going to put up a set and it can't crash and fall and hurt somebody, I better know something about slope and rise over run. I need those mathematical formulas. So I think there is a way, without this kill and drill, double math, double English, to say, how do we make education engaging and engancho? Because without that, you get nothing. You just get dropouts. And that's what's happening in Mexico. That's what's happening here. That's what's happening everywhere. So we know that the current approach has not produced very much. We also know that schools that deeply value the arts have a much higher rate of kids finishing college. So we ought to learn from what we know. So I hope that helps. I certainly think reading is urgent. Everything for me is about reading and writing. I don't want to forget about writing. But kill and drill doesn't get us very far.
Eric, are you ready to close it up?
Yes. Actually, I was typing on the chat, like please, for everybody that is here, don't forget to sign up for HAED. I just put on the chat the link to really join the conversation and join this network that is growing every day. And Linda, thanks for a magnificent presentation. We love all the time that we speak with you and we interact with you. We learn so many things new, and it reminds us to really try to think on this concept. It's not a concept; it's a way to do things. Just way to listen to people and not just to be authoritarian and saying like this is the way. It's I love your intervention. I love the presentation, and thank you for everybody that was here. Thank you, Gustavo, for moderating the session, and thank you everybody for being here.
Thank you, thank you. I put my website in the chat. You can sign up to get my blog. I'm going to be posting about Laura later this week, so you'll hear about her amazing award. And muchas gracias a todos. It really gave questions. Gracias.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.